Hey, what's up, class? First of all, thanks for being flexible. Be another week we miss each other in person. It's 3 weeks, so sorry about that. Hope you had a good spring break. And again, thanks for being willing to do the YouTube since we can't use our classroom today. So as I said in the announcement, I will expect you to have at least one comment or question about the material covered today. Not one per chapter, just one about the whole thing, just to prove that you're engaged and at least watched part of the video to some extent. So without further ado, we'll talk about Chapter 7. As you can see, is intake questions and a little bit of the report writing. And hopefully this is relevant to you as we have the report writing assignment coming up in a couple of weeks, I believe. So we'll talk about intake interview questions as we're chapter 7 and finally getting to the intake itself. We'll talk about the writing, as I said. So the book starts and asks, man, what is an interview? 175 pages into a book about intakes and interviews. So good job, book, for finally getting to the damn point. But essentially, an interview is an assessment of functioning. Historically, interviews took multiple 50-minute sessions. Early days in counseling and psychology and therapy believed that they needed numerous and multiple sessions to have an accurate diagnosis and treatment plan. Again, I disagree with all of that. I think if you're effective with your time, you can be much faster than that. So your interview should ultimately answer these questions. Is there a problem? And if so, is it emotional, mental, or behavioral, or some combination? What treatment is indicated, like exposure therapy, talking about past trauma, or cognitive restructuring, or anxiety treatment, and who and what setting is best for treatment. And that is, it includes if you should be doing outpatient therapy, so that's where you go to a therapy office for 40 to 60 minutes, do therapy and then leave, or intensive outpatient, and that is where you, for 3 days a week, you go to, I believe, like 2 or 3 hours worth of therapy on 3 separate days. There's partial hospitalization, which is 5 days a week, typically from like 8 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, kind of a full day. And then there's full hospitalization. And those are kind of like stair-stepping up in terms of severity. So if you're in extreme dire straits, actively, imminently suicidal or homicidal, or having severe breaks from reality or psychosis, you'll want to be probably full hospitalization. A lot of people do rehab, alcohol, and drug abuse treatment, and partial hospitalization or intensive outpatient. And you typically want to stair step back down as you get better. So you also want to answer, what are the client's chief complaints and what are their goals for therapy? What is the client's personal history that led them to get to this point, which is what a majority of the questions are centered around, if you will. And then how well and how poorly is the client functioning at current. So chief complaints and goals, you might have to connect the chief complaints to the goals, and it can help identify therapy targets more clearly and ultimately instill hope. So an example would be saying something like, you have no energy and are struggling to find joy in things. Maybe something we can work towards is getting you out of the house and more engaged in things that feel meaningful to you. And then again, I'd like to emphasize hope at the end of that, saying I'm pretty confident we can start trending in the right direction, or something like that. Try not to spend the entire session on one problem unless the client denies other problems. If we were in person, I would ask, how do we prioritize if the client says multiple problems? Like in this example here, I feel anxious, I hate my job, my relationship sucks, and my favorite pet goldfish died. How would we prioritize where to go with that? But I'll just give you my answer. Ultimately, I would probably say something, say 60% of the time I would let the client pick if all 3 of them seem roughly the same. If there's something that's more pertinent, something that's like much more significant, like if their anxiety is like a 9 out of 10 in terms of stress, but they really do hate their job, I'd say, man, your anxiety, you rated 9 out of 10, you hate your job is only a 7 out of 10, so let's start with anxiety. And ultimately, I feel like dysfunction and distress are the 2 best metrics for how to pick these things. So dysfunction is how engaged are they in like necessary life tasks? Like, are they able to conduct their own hygiene? Are they able to take care of their finances? How well are they functioning? And then distress is emotionally, how are they feeling and how much stress are they in? So distress and dysfunction would be the 2 things I go to help decide how to prioritize clients' problems. So You want to analyze symptoms concisely. Time, trigger, and trajectory questions I think are very effective towards that end. So you ask, when did your anxiety start for time? What makes your anxiety worse for trigger? And has your anxiety got worse or gotten better since it started? That's trajectory. And then ACT specifically, again, ACT being acceptance and commitment therapy, talks about your teams, thoughts, emotions, associations, memories, and stories. So I really like having that as an example. If somebody's talking about having depression and you're not sure how to ask more pointed questions about their depression experience, you can ask about their teams, their thoughts, their associations, memories, stories, all that stuff. So other conceptual considerations, the book goes through basic ID, which is behavior, affect, sensation, imagery, cognition, interpersonal relationship, and the last one is drugs. Sorry, my little picture is on top of it, but drugs. Yeah, and I don't think I can move my picture. No. So that's another way of looking at how the person's doing in all those domains of behavior, drugs, interpersonal relationships, that sort of thing. So obtaining background history, if you start with the chief complaint, you may consider asking why are you coming to therapy now, and then transition into personal history. I know I talked about it previously that I'm not a big fan of starting with chief complaint just because it's easy to get bogged down there and miss possibly other pertinent information. But if you do elect to start with the chief complaint, I think asking why are you coming to therapy now, and then going back to personal history is a way to make that work. The book recommends being non-directive when your interview questions, like tell me about what you remember growing up versus tell me about your relationship with your parents growing up. I would probably opt to be a little bit more directive because if given too much broad information, some people get really anxious and they're like, man, what do you want to know about my childhood? And B, also for time's sake, if you are a little bit more pointed and specific, tell me about your relationships with parents growing up, you'll be a little bit more effective with the time. And again, ultimately, if you're trying to do your intake interview and do the actual a little bit of therapy in that first visit, time is crucial to be effective with. So there are content areas that most interviews want to focus on. As you can see, family, school, friendships, work history, all these things. The thing my picture is covering is birth, pregnancy, milestones met for each kid, and spiritual and religious history. So these are some of the content areas if you want just broad categories of things that a good interview should cover. These are what the book recommends. So interpersonal styles, some theories debate how interpersonal styles play out in the therapy room, especially during an intake or an interview. Psychoanalytic, again, and that's like Sigmund Freud, where it talks a lot about like our subconscious and our subconscious desires, sees behavior as indicative of your true personality, and behavioralists, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, ACT is a part of the behavioralism approach, may see behavior as a function of the situation and or cognition that's occurring. So ultimately, they'll consider how the client has interacted with people in their past, their present, and how they are interacting with you in the therapy room in that time. So whenever you talk about how somebody is interacting with you in the therapy room at that time, that's called parallel process or isomorphism. And sometimes people use it to be slightly confrontational, saying something like, as we talk, you are kind of like pushing me out and you're not giving me much time to respond as your therapist. I wonder if you're doing that to your significant other, and that's where some of the stress comes from. So basically kind of mirroring what your experience is of a client and wondering if that's what people on the outside experience in them as well. Again, that's isomorphism or parallel process. So interpersonal style can also be defined by some personality psychology theories. There's the big 5 personality traits, aka OCEAN. Again, right now I would ask if any of y'all know what the OCEAN acronym stands for, but it stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Openness is what it sounds like. How open are you to new experiences? Like if it's a Friday and you want to go out to eat, do you go somewhere that you've been 100 times because you know it's consistent, reliable, and good? Or do you want to go somewhere new and adventurous? Conscientiousness is how thorough and attentive to detail you are. Typically, people that are higher in conscientiousness are a lot more organized, have color-coded planners and calendars, that sort of thing. Extroversion is how outgoing and sociable you are in that capacity. Introversion is the opposite, how much you value your time alone. Some people say that extroversion and introversion is just how much energy you get from either A, being with people if you're extroverted, or B, being by yourself if you're introverted. A A is agreeableness, and agreeableness is what it sounds like. How likely are you to tell somebody they're wrong if you believe they're wrong? Or how likely are you to go with the flow whenever there's some type of like mandate, if you will. And N, neuroticism, has kind of two meanings. One is like emotional stability, like how well do you do whenever there's a little bit of adversity thrown at you. Like if you're on your way to class, but as soon as you walk out to your car, you have a flat tire. Are you the type to be like, well, all right, that sucks, let's get it fixed? Or do you like have a panic attack and freak out? So that measures neuroticism. Another definition of neuroticism I've seen is threat awareness. I think it's a little bit more uplifting sounding than emotional stability, and more uplifting sounding than neuroticism. But basically, how threat aware are you? I have one of my closest friends, probably like the most threat-aware person I know. She'll get in her car and adjust her mirrors every time, adjust her seat every time. I'm like, man, like you're the only one that drives your car. Why are you doing this? And she's like, oh, I just want to make sure I minimize the chance of getting in a wreck if my mirrors were a little bit off. So she's very, very threat-aware that it's possible to get into a wreck, so she acts accordingly. There is a gender effect on threat awareness, neuroticism, if you will. Women are typically a little bit higher in threat awareness, and I think that's obviously a function that men are on average bigger and stronger, and so probably have less need. Again, I know I've talked about it in class, but if I'm walking and there's a guy 50 feet behind me at night, I might be aware of it, but I might not feel anxiety or panic unless they start like walking faster. Whereas if I were a female, if I were a woman, I probably would feel a lot more threat awareness if there was somebody walking behind me late at night, and then even more threat awareness if they started walking faster and trying to close the gap. So these are the Cattell-Horn 16 personality theory traits. And there's a really good 16 PF, 16 personality factors test that you could take online for free. If you're interested, let me know. I can send a link to you. But it puts out like this really pretty graph that shows how high or how low you are on all of these traits. Like, are you really high on abstractedness or are you low on it? And you can see all the definitions there. So abstractedness, apprehension, dominance, et cetera, et cetera. But all of personality psych, personality theory seems like they're not 100% sure on too much. Like they're very sure that the big 5 ocean traits exist. They're pretty sure more exist, but I've heard a lot of pushback that there's not quite 16 traits, that these traits have a lot of overlap. So take it with a grain of salt. But I do think personality theory is interesting. But this is the 16 factors identified by Cattell. Cattell, Horn, and Carroll are also famous in psychology world for having theories of intelligence, like the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory, very cleverly named. It talks about general intelligence versus fluid intelligence. So talking about current functioning, you typically want to end your intake and interview discussing present-day life functioning. Ask what is a normal day like for you. And then if a client's overly distressed as you're wrapping up that session, may want to consider redirecting the conversation to something a little less threatening, or acknowledge their bravery or willingness to talk about tough stuff today during that therapy session. So I like to ask, man, what are you doing the rest of the day? What are you going to do after our session? What are you going to be doing this evening? Again, hopefully to kind of get their mind off of whatever difficult stuff we just talked about. So towards goals and change, I think it's really important to ask clients how they know they'll achieve their goals. So asking something like, what personal change do you hope to achieve this next year? I talked about fail states and win states. So in video games, there are fail states and win states, and I guess probably in all games, like sports as well. A fail state is losing, and win state is winning, obviously. So if somebody says, oh, I want my anxiety to get better. So I ask, like, what is a fail state when you talk about that? They'd say, oh, my anxiety getting worse, or having more panic attacks, something like that. What is a win state? Win state would be going to my son's soccer game, even though I have social phobia. So stuff like that. Excuse me. So other things that can influence your intake is paperwork and intake forms. You can ask deep personal questions, which some may appreciate while others may not. I know y'all did the self-intake earlier this semester for me, and some of y'all talked about how it felt like maybe either invasive, or some of y'all felt it was like benign to do the questions in paper form. And so obviously it can feel very different answering questions on a sheet of paper versus answering them like in a live conversation with somebody. The setting can have an influence on what the intake feels like. If you're in a hospital versus an office, you might have different goals. And then your theoretical orientation. Again, psychoanalysts focus a lot on the past and the subconscious. Solution-focused clinicians focus a lot on the future. Person-centered therapists focus a lot on the present. Your background and training will also influence these things. Licensed marriage family therapists, or LMFTs, will typically want to know how people are doing in relationships. Counselors will focus in on like listening skills specifically, so a little bit more person-centered. Psychologists specialize in assessment and diagnosis, so they might be thinking about that during their interviews and might ask more questions related to that. And psychiatrists typically ask a lot of questions around mental functioning, like memory and like attention and processing speed and things like that. So report writing for counseling, you typically only need to write an intake note, then you'll write progress notes for follow-up sessions. For assessments, you will write, you might have to write an entire assessment based on your interview, and I'm not able to open up my example at this time, but it is available. But basically, it's a really long report that goes through an actual assessment. And so that is somebody who took like an IQ test and some other tests to see if they have ADHD or something like that, I believe. Y'all do not have to do an assessment for this class. The intake report is just writing out the notes or writing out in sentence form the things that you wrote on self-intake. And then for both, you will need to include behavioral observations, as you can see here. So something like Will was observed to tap his feet throughout his interview, his hygiene was poor and hair disheveled, made intermittent eye contact, etc., etc. So behavioral observations are extremely important, no matter if you're writing for an assessment report or an intake note. So whenever you're meeting with people, also keep kind of a log or a tally in your mind, any notable behavioral observations. It's almost harder to write whenever things seem normal, but you would just say eye contact was within normal limits, tone of voice and volume of speech was within normal limits, thought process appeared to be normal limits, cognitive status was unremarkable, and things like that. So know who all your audience is. Write everything in the world of psychology as if all these people are standing over your shoulder. Your client is standing there, your supervisor is standing there, your practice owner, manager, administrator is standing there, your client's attorney is standing there, client's insurance company, professional colleagues, ethics boards. Sounds like a lot, but truly just write knowing that all these people may at some point look at your note. So if your client is interpersonally challenging, say that. Don't say that my client is a spoiled brat, obviously. So just know that these are all people that might have access to your notes at some point, so keep that in mind as you write. So be concise and professional, but not too professional. I wrote the word lachrymose, which means tearful or crying. And my supervisor is like, nope, that's too fancy of a word to put into a note. I had another colleague write the word comportment. Comportment means behavior. Ambulate means to walk. And so those words are probably too formal, too high level, because most people would need to go grab a dictionary to see what those words mean. But then there's questions like DBT. Do we write DBT? DBT stands for dialectical behavioral therapy. You probably could write DBT because it is a pretty common acronym used in psychology world. And I don't think you have to, if your client's attorney doesn't know DBT, then I don't think you're responsible for that. I think you could write DBT. Don't use contractions, say they are instead of their. So write professionally, much like what you would turn into like a college professor. And then highlight confidentiality as much as you can every time you can. Password protect files whenever possible. Everything digital should be encrypted whenever you're transmitting it. I personally will typically have my client's initials, their date of birth, or my client's initials and my first session as like my digital password for any PDFs I send to clients, client attorneys, or anytime it's requested. And I'll give a phone call to, if it's a client's attorney that's like, hey, I need this person's notes, I'll give a phone call to the client's attorney saying, hey, the password is the client's first initial, last initial, and then date of my first session, which is this date. So password protect as many files as you can. So whenever you're writing an intake report, you need to write the identifying information and the reason for referral. So name, age, sex, gender, all those things. Presenting complaint, behavioral observations like you talked about. And here are the broad categories of behavioral observations: appearance, components of speech, mood, thought content, etc. history of present illness, treatment history, psychiatric family history, relevant medical history, developmental history, social and family history, current situation functioning, and diagnostic impressions, and then your case formulation and treatment plan. And then recommendations. I think that's it. So these, whenever you're writing an intake note, all of these things would need to be present. So ideally, I want these things to be present on your intake note report that you'll be turning into me. And some of it you'll have to totally make up, and that's fine. Like you might not have recommendations because you haven't taken other psychology classes. Just say deep breathing or something like that. You might not have diagnostic impressions because you haven't taken other psychology classes. Again, totally fine to say anxiety or depression. You don't have to be too specific. So make it up if